hard to imagine that Hollywood hasn't jumped all over this. You would think it would be box office gold because it's part Spartacus and part Braveheart and part Amistad and part Glory with a little bit of Dances with Wolves thrown in. A story decades long of oppression and freedom fighting. I don't understand why there hasn't been more attention to John Horse and the Black Seminoles, but hopefully we can correct this. John Horse and the Black Seminoles deserve to be remembered for a number of reasons. They created the largest haven in the U.S. South for runaway slaves. They led the largest slave revolt in U.S. history. They secured the only emancipation of rebellious slaves prior to the U.S. Civil War, and they formed the largest mass exodus of slaves across the United States, moving from the Florida Everglades through Indian Territory, what would become Oklahoma, eventually locating in Mexico, where they secured title to their own land. It's a remarkable story. It's overlooked not just by filmmakers, it's not well known in popular culture, and in fact it's been overlooked by historians of slavery, if you can believe it. In the early 18th century, two groups in particular fled the colonial South into Spanish Florida, into the Everglades. One of these groups were Seminoles, who were migrating from the various colonies, just trying to avoid white encroachment, basically, trying to move someplace that white colonists weren't. And the other group was runaway slaves, people who were fleeing and trying to create a free life for themselves. Both were welcome in Florida, and in fact, the Spanish crown offered runaway slaves their freedom if they would defend the land for the crown, for the Spanish. So a mixed society emerged in the Everglades of intermarriage, family intermingling between these runaway slaves and the Seminoles. And in fact, the first legally sanctioned black free town in the North American continent was in the Spanish Florida Everglades. After the American Revolution, people living in the southern states didn't really like living that close to a large armed population of former slaves, particularly when they were in league with the local Native American nation, the large armed group of free Seminoles. And they knew that their own slaves felt free to run away and be harbored by this group. They knew that they were welcomed. And so from George Washington's administration on, there was questions of what do we do about the problem of the Florida Everglades. In 1818, this was James Monroe's administration, General Andrew Jackson actually moved into Florida, invaded it, not authorized to do so. He was actually pursuing justice against those who'd attacked Fort Scott in Georgia, but he did it anyway. He went into Florida and claimed it for the United States. When he seized the peninsula, he took the opportunity to execute some of the people who opposed him and also to clean out some of the areas of former slaves and Seminoles because he felt that this would make it better for annexation. The United States then soon actually bought Florida from the Spanish. When Jackson became president, he decided to make sure that the black Seminole communities were moved out by force. So he pursued this in his policy, his larger policy of Indian removal. This led to the Second Seminole War, which was 1835 to 1842, and became the largest and costliest of the so-called Indian Wars. Because the two communities were tied together, that is, the former slaves and the Seminoles, when the Seminoles were attacked in the Seminole War, this led to an uprising of the former slaves. In April of 1836, black Seminoles and their Indian allies moved together to create what was the largest slave rebellion in U.S. history. This wasn't just a matter of runaway slaves. More than 385 plantation slaves ran away from their masters and joined the Black Seminoles, essentially in laying waste to the Florida sugar mills, which were some of the most valuable plantations in the whole continent. One Seminole leader at the time was the leader Osceola, who is justly remembered by history. Another leader who rose up at this time was John Horse, who was ethnically a Black Seminole, and who would ultimately lead his people on a long and trying exodus for their freedom. In 1838, John Horse and the Black Seminoles agreed to stop fighting the U.S. government in exchange for moving to what was then considered to be Indian Territory, which is now today the state of Oklahoma, and for legal recognition of their freedom. So despite the fact many of them were runaway slaves, they would have the opportunity to start over again as free individuals. Once they moved from the Everglades to Indian Territory, however, they found that their freedom was under attack, both by whites and by other Native Americans. In 1848, a decade after they had made the agreement with the U.S. government, the U.S. Attorney General announced that the government never had the authority, the power to recognize their freedom. And in fact, they were still, those who had been slaves, still enslaved. This was like opening season on them, basically declaring that they were there for the picking. And so they did the only thing they could do. They fled once again. Without security in Indian Territory, Horse and his Seminole ally Coacuchi promptly went to Mexico, where slavery was already illegal and had been for a couple of decades. There, Horse became famous as a general in the Mexican army, and his people found a way to make a life. Once they relocated to Mexico, things changed. When slave catchers from the Republic of Texas went over the border to try to find the runaway slaves, now free men, they met resistance not only from the Black Seminoles, but also from the Mexicans and the Mexican army itself. Eventually, the Black Seminoles, led by Horse, gained legally recognized Mexican land, Nacimiento. Why isn't this recognized today? Well, for one thing, historians tend to be historians of Native American history or historians of slavery, but there's not many that move among these subjects, and it's a bit confusing because you have both the issue of runaway slaves and the issue of Native Americans kind of blended together, so it seems to fall through the cracks. Tradition is that Nat Turner's rebellion is the big turning point in the history of slavery and slave revolt. But that happened before the rebellion of the Black Seminoles, so it doesn't really fit the traditional trajectory. And perhaps most importantly, it really represents a blemish on U.S. history, not only because of the poor treatment of Native America as represented by the Seminole War, not only the poor treatment of African Americans through the device of slavery, but also because this group really did manage to negotiate a separate peace with the U.S. government, and 10 years later the government turned their backs on them. So it's, in multiple ways, a difficult story for people of the United States to tell. But it's worth remembering that a community of freedom fighters trekked from Florida to Oklahoma to Mexico and found ultimately peace and freedom and prosperity in lives that they could direct as their own. I recommend highly the website johnhorse.com for more information.
Shalom, Kahala Yahweh, Bashem Yashai, Bashem Kwapradash. Double honors my teachers, the apostles and elders of Great Millstone. Peace and mercy to the elect, who are the house of David reborn again in this generation. And Shalom to the 130 Yasharallah, who today are known as the Negroes, Latinos, and Native Americans, who before losing our true heritage, we were known as, and still are, the true Hebrew Israelites of the Holy Bible. So in today's lesson, we're going to talk about the Seminole Indians, also known as the tribe of Reuben. You see, the video we just watched talked about the Seminole Indians, and namely an individual called John Horse. And you see, John Horse, along with all the Seminole Indians, they come from the seed line of Jacob, right? Also, or known as Israel, making them Israelites. And because of that, they're specifically known as the Reubenites, right? The tribe of Reuben, because they are the firstborn of Jacob and Leah. This is Reuben's blessing given at his father's deathbed when he was blessing all his 12 sons. This is Genesis 49:3. Reuben, thou art my firstborn, my might, and the beginning of my strength, the excellency of dignity, and the excellency of power. Unstable as water, thou shalt not excel, because thou wentest up to thy father's bed, then defiled thou it, and went up to my couch. Now we all know the story of Reuben and how he slept with one of his father's, I believe she was a concubine. But this is ultimately why Reuben was overlooked for, I guess you could say, leadership, and it ultimately fell upon Judah. Now that being said, Reuben is considered part of the northern tribe, and because of that, he also, or should I say, they also went into captivity when the rest of the northern tribes went into captivity to the Syrian Empire. And this, let's go to the Bible timeline. This took place in 722 BC. Also, you can read about it in 2 Kings 17 and 23, when the Lord basically was done with the northern kingdom and he kicked us out of the land. And you can also read about how that all started in the book of Judith, when the Assyrian army first came up against us. Now, through the mercy of the Lord and through his will, Judith was able to overcome the Assyrian general Heliophanes and buy us about 10 years to stay in that land. But ultimately, we got kicked out. And when we went into captivity in Assyria, we eventually stayed captives there for about 100 years until the Babylonians came and conquered the Assyrians. And when they conquered them, after about 100 years of our captivity, we pretty much were freed. A lot of us went back to Jerusalem, but the majority of us came here to the Americas. And again, this includes the tribe of Reuben. Let's read about that now. That's in 2nd Ezra 13 and 40. Those are the 10 tribes which were carried away prisoners out of their own land in the time of Hoshea, the king whom Salmanasar, the king of Assyria, led away captive. And he carried them over the waters, and so came they into another land. This is talking about Syria, and how ultimately we were basically transplanted into other kingdoms of the Assyrian Empire. And when we were taken out of the land of North Israel, the king of Assyria, he ultimately brought in some, I guess you would call them Iranians, right? People from that area. They're historically referred to as the Kuthans. They brought them into the land of Israel to replace us. Okay, you also could read about this in the book 2 Kings, about how the heathens were planted in the land of northern Israel, and how the lions would attack them because they weren't keeping the laws, to the point where the Assyrians had to bring back a Levite priest to teach the heathens how to live by the laws, so that way the land wouldn't eject them out of it. Continuing, verse 41. But they took this counsel amongst themselves, that they would leave the multitude of the heathen and go forth into a further country where never mankind dwelt, that they there might keep their statutes, which they never kept in their own land. And they entered into the Euphrates by the narrow places of the river. For the Most High then showed signs for them, and held still the flood till they were passed over. Now this is ultimately talking about the crossing of the Atlantic Ocean. Okay, this is because when you go follow this path down the Euphrates rivers, ultimately leads the 10 tribes around the Horn of Africa, ultimately past the Atlantic River and across Hurricane Alley, which is what that corridor is referred to. Continuing, it says, "For through that country there was a great way to go, namely of a year and a half, and the same region is called Azareth." And Azareth also basically means unknown land. Okay, and when it says here a year and a half, you got to premise that with the knowledge that Solomon's navy, which were basically Hamites, they took 3 years to come to the Americas. They called it Ophir, right? They would come here to the Americas, get all manner of resources, gold, peacocks, or turkeys basically, and other items, and then they would take it back. It was a year and a half here and a year and a half back. That's ultimately how the Northern Kingdom, how we knew that this place existed, and we ultimately came over here to live a secluded lifestyle where we could get back to the basics of following the laws. Continuing, 46, "And then dwelt they there until the latter time, and now when they shall begin to come." Right? And right here, it tells you that the Northern Kingdom, the 10 tribes, would be here in the Americas, in the land of Azareth, until the end days, until the second coming of the Messiah, the latter time. And also right here, this is a prophecy where it says, "And now when they shall begin to come." This here is talking about when the Southern Kingdom would start to come over, would also come over here. And we know that this happened during the North Atlantic slave trade, which started roughly around 1618, about 7 years after the 1611 King James Version Bible was first published. Okay, so that's how the Northern Kingdom, including the Seminole Indians, got over here to the Americas. Now, besides the Bible, here is an account that was recorded by the missionaries who came over here when the Europeans came over here and started to encounter the native Indians here. Well, this is found in this book called The Lost Tribes of the Promised Lands, right? Written by Ronald Sanders, and this was published back in 1978. And again, this original testimony comes from an older book from, I think, Diego Duran, or some of the basically the older missionaries who came with the Spanish and other European countries and basically interviewed the natives. Well, let's go and read it. It says, "Upon hearing her words," her is talking about a translator that the Spanish missionaries had with them. It says, "Upon hearing her words, they rose, went over to Montesinos." Montesinos is this Vatican missionary, and to his utter astonishment said, "Shemai, Yasharal, Yahweh, Alahayanawa, Yahweh Achad, which is, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our power, the Lord is one." They had recited in Hebrew the fundamental credo of Judaism. A brief conversation then ensued in their common ancestral tongue. Basically, they were speaking Hebrew, right? The Native American or the Native Indians, along with the missionary and the interpreter. According to Montesinos, whose fluency in it is almost as perplexing to the reader of his narrative as is that of the 3 mysterious new companions. So basically, they ran into these 3 native Indians. Okay, and this is what they told him. They said they told him that they themselves were of the tribe of Reuben. You see that? The tribe of Reuben are the Seminole Indians, and that the tribe of Joseph lived on the island nearby. Now, the tribe of Joseph is ultimately talking about the Puerto Ricans and the Cubans. Okay, the Puerto Ricans would be the tribe of Ephraim, and the tribe of Manasseh would be the Cubans. But if you put them both together, those are the tribe of Joseph, right? Or also you could refer to both of them as Joseph, but no, mainly it's Ephraim, who is mainly referred to as the tribe of Joseph. But you see, here is a historic account of the native Indians referring to themselves as the tribe of Reuben. Now this took place around like the 1500s, okay? So by the time when this man, right, John Horse, came onto the scene, this had already been about 300 years down the road. So in those 300 years, you had the Spanish and French wars, or the French and Indian wars. You had all these different events that took place and that ultimately led to the losing of the heritage for the Seminole Indians. And again, as you heard him say, a lot of Southern Kingdom that were enslaved had fled from their captivity and went down and mingled amongst the tribe of Reuben. Okay, this is how they kept their darker hues, and ultimately this is why you find so many so-called Negroes amongst the tribe of Reuben. But just as John Horse here, right, his father was a Seminole native Indian, but his mother was a runaway Judite slave, still making him of the tribe of Reuben. Let's go and read a little bit about him, right? John Horse, he was born in 1812 to 1882. It says, John Horse, also known as Juan Caballo, John Kawaya, or Gopher John, was the dominant personality in Seminole Maroon affairs for half a century. He counseled Seminole leaders, served as an agent of the U.S. government, and became a Mexican Army officer. He served the Seminole Maroons as warrior, diplomat, and patriarch. Represented their interest in Washington, D.C. and Mexico City. He fought against the United States and the French and Indians and survived 3 wars, 4 attempts on his life, and the grasp of slave hunters. Little is known of John Horse's early years, but by 1826 he was living in his owner's village near Tampa Bay, Florida. During the Second Seminole War, 1835 to 42, he initially led Maroons against the U.S. forces in Florida, but offered the promise of freedom. He agreed to surrender and relocate west with the Seminoles in March 1837. By 1840, John Horse had married Susan July, the daughter of a Seminole Maroon guide and interpreter. Fearing that his family and his fellow Maroons would be re-enslaved, Horse entered into an alliance with the disaffected Seminoles and left Indian Territory. And this right here was in Oklahoma, by the way. All right, and this happened. This was like the March of Tears that took place, where that devil, President Samuel Jackson, had caused all the Indians to basically be moved off of their land and taken to reservations. Right? It says in November 1849 for northern Mexico, naming Horse's followers Mascagos. The Mexicans in 1852 gave the Maroons, Seminoles, and the band of southern Kikapos separate land grants at Nacimiento to establish military colonies. In exchange for land, tools, and livestock, the immigrants agreed to fight against Apache and Comanche raiders. The Mexican authorities viewed John Horse as the undisputed head of the Mascagos and referred to him as El Capitan Juan Caballo. During the summer of 1870, John Horse and many of the Mascagos returned to the United States and settled near Fort Duncan, Texas. In August, the able-bodied men enrolled in the U.S. Army as a new unit that came to be known as the Seminole Negro Indian Scouts. John Horse, however, never served with the Scouts. After a failed assassination attempt against him by white Texans, or I should say Edomite Texans, Horse again led the Mascagos into Mexico. He died there in 1882 while on a mission to represent them before the Mexican president Porfirio Diaz. Now another thing too, this man, besides being a great warrior, because again that's the spirit on the Seminole Indians, right? The tribe of Reuben, right? What did the blessing on them and the prophecy say?
that they are the beginning of my strength, the excellency of dignity. So this is why our brothers from the tribe of Reuben have that valiant spirit upon them, right? A great example of this would be the elder Malcolm from Chicago. This is a spirit that the Reubenites tend to have. Now, like I said, John Horse, besides him being a great warrior and a de facto leader of the people, one thing that he ultimately did is that he tried to work things out with Edom here in America, and also with Issachar down there in Mexico, right? We just heard how he had gone down to meet with the Mexican president, but up here on his plaque that you could find in Texas, down here it tells you, it says, from his new home in Indian Territory, right, Oklahoma, John twice journeyed to Washington, D.C. to plead his people's case, the Commissioner of Indian Affairs. Years later, John claimed he and General Jessup met with President Polk to discuss the plight of the Seminoles. In late 1849, oppressed and hunted after their freedom was withdrawn by the federal government. Two groups of Seminoles and blacks led by Horse and Cocoche slipped out of the Indian Territory into Texas en route to freedom in Mexico. So there you go. See? And then later it tells you that right here it says, after recovering, he returned to Nacimiento, Mexico, following a trip to meet with President Porfirio Diaz to plead for his people's permanent land rights in Nacimiento. He died in Mexico City in 1882 at the age of 70. So this was a very powerful man, right, who had a lot of spiritual dignity to him, which is why he commanded so much respect, and he had so much authority amongst all these different groups. But you see, one thing about this man, which is why I wanted to bring a story out, is he was unable to free our people, even his own tribes, right? He tried it with the U.S. government, though he was also known for leading the biggest and the only successful slave revolt was led by this man. But the thing is he was unable to turn around the curses. And why is that? Well, it tells you here in Deuteronomy 28 and 29. And thou shalt grope at noonday, as the blind gropeth in darkness, and thou shalt not prosper in thy ways, and thou shalt be only oppressed and spoiled evermore, and no man shall save thee. So though John Horse, though he comes from an excellent stock, he's of a great people, the Israelites of the tribe of Reuben, he was unable to free his tribe, and that's because there was a curse upon him, his people, and his nation. And we are still in this curse till today. But the great news is that we are now coming to the end of our curses, or end of our punishment, I should say. And we are about to inherit the world along with our Messiah, Yahweh Shai, who the world ignorantly calls Jesus Christ. And Lord willing, this man is here today, back in the reincarnation. And if he's not here today, he'll be with us in the kingdom. This is Jeremiah 50 and 33. Thus saith Yahweh Bashim Shai of hosts, the children of Israel and the children of Judah were oppressed together, and all that took them captives held them fast. They refused to let them go. So this is the plight for John Horse and the rest of us Hebrew Israelites. We are still, till this day, in our captivity. And though there's exceptions to the rules, and there are going to be brothers and sisters who are going to be able to free themselves a little here and a little there, we are still ultimately in a form of captivity. And we're not going to get out of this captivity, out of this oppression, until our Messiah comes back. Right? So I just wanted to highlight this, Akim. Hopefully you found this edifying. Until the next time, I want to give all honor and glory and praises to Yahweh B'Hashem Yahushai B'Hashem Kokodash. Shalom.